The judge looked Elijah Cross dead in the eyes and said, "You people always think you can walk into my courtroom and demand something you were never entitled to." And Elijah, 43 years old, hands folded on the defense table, not a single muscle in his face moving, said nothing, because he had been waiting 14 months for this exact moment, and Judge Harlan Peck had no idea who he was sitting across from. This is the story of how a man the system tried to break ended up being the one holding the hammer. Elijah Cross grew up in Decatur, Georgia, third of 5 kids, in a house where the heat went out twice a winter, and his mother worked doubles at a nursing home to make sure they never missed a meal. His father, Gerald Cross, was a man who believed in 2 things above everything else: your word and the law. Gerald had done everything right. Never a parking ticket, coached Little League for 15 years, knew every neighbor on the block by name. He still got pulled over 17 times in a decade on the same stretch of highway, not once for anything real. Just for being a black man in a car. Elijah watched his father accept it. Every time. He would come home from those stops, sit at the kitchen table, and say the same thing: the law is bigger than the men who enforce it. You keep believing in it even when it doesn't believe in you yet. That word stuck. Elijah went to Morehouse, then to Georgetown Law, then to the DOJ, where he spent 6 years in the Public Integrity Section, the division that investigates corruption by public officials. He was good at it, meticulous, patient, the kind of attorney who could hold 17 contradictory threads in his head and find the one that unraveled all of them. By the time he was 38, he was a senior investigator. By 40, he was the deputy director of a specialized federal task force that didn't even have its name on the DOJ's public website. His official title, if you looked it up in internal directories, was Deputy Director of the Office of Judicial Integrity. His job was to investigate federal judges. Not publicly, not loudly, with the kind of patience that made years feel like moves on a chessboard that nobody else could see. The case that brought him to Millhaven, Alabama, started with a court clerk named Tobias Reeves, who couldn't sleep. Tobias had worked in the Millhaven Federal Courthouse for 9 years. He filed motions, processed dockets, organized exhibit logs. He was the invisible infrastructure of a courtroom that handled everything from tax fraud to civil rights cases. And for 9 years, Tobias had noticed things. Plea bargains that didn't make sense. Defendants, almost always black, almost always poor, who came in with decent cases and left with maximum sentences. And then there were the defendants who came in with worse cases and walked out with suspended sentences and fines that a Walmart manager could pay off in a month. Those defendants were almost always white, almost always connected to one of 2 real estate development firms that Tobias had started tracking because he recognized the names on courthouse visitor logs. He wrote it all down. In a spiral notebook, for 7 years. In the winter of 2 years ago, Tobias Reeves mailed that notebook to the DOJ field office in Birmingham. He didn't expect much. He had seen what happened to people who made noise about things like this. What he didn't know was that the Birmingham field office forwarded it up the chain to a man in Washington who had been building a separate case on Judge Harlan Peck for nearly 2 years already. Harlan Peck had been on the federal bench for 19 years. He was the kind of man who got his portrait painted for the courthouse lobby while he was still alive. 61 years old, silver-haired, the son of a state senator, with a handshake that every defense attorney in 3 counties has described as warm. He gave speeches about justice at Rotary Club lunches. He had a foundation that donated school supplies to kids in low-income districts. Every August, the same districts whose residents he was sending to prison at rates that had never been statistically explained. What Tobias's notebook provided was granular. Dates, case numbers, sentence lengths, the names of the 2 real estate firms, and one detail that made Elijah sit up straight when he read it. A pattern of cases where defendants facing potential federal obstruction charges had those charges quietly dropped after their attorneys filed motions in Peck's court, motions that Peck ruled on in under 48 hours with no explanation in private chambers. The 2 real estate firms were Aldridge Crane Properties and Monfort Capital Group. Both had projects in Millhaven County. Both had benefited from land condemnation rulings. Rulings that stripped black homeowners of property in 3 specific neighborhoods over a 6-year period. Rulings signed by Judge Harlan Peck. Elijah built the case the way his father taught him to build anything, 1 nail at a time, so solid that no wind could take it down. He had 4 investigators working in parallel. Financial subpoenas, phone records, property transfer documents. They found a shell company, Carver Hill Consulting, that had received payments from both Aldridge Crane and Montfort Capital. Carver Hill Consulting had one registered agent. That agent's personal address was a lake house in Talladega County, registered to a trust. The trust's beneficiary was Harlan Peck's brother-in-law. The money trail was there. But Elijah needed more. He needed to see how Peck operated in real time. Because financial corruption alone was one thread. What Elijah was building was a pattern, a prosecutable, undeniable, iron-tight pattern of judicial misconduct, bribery and civil rights violations so systematic that it would not only take Peck off the bench but trigger reviews of every major ruling he had made in the past decade. That required presence. That required watching. So Elijah Cross did something that his supervisors called unorthodox and that he called necessary. He moved to Millhaven, not as a federal investigator, as a man named Elijah Cross, who said he was a consultant, working remotely for a legal research firm, who rented a two-bedroom house on Caldwell Street, who went to the same barbershop, where courthouse staff went on Saturday mornings, who ordered coffee at the diner 2 blocks from the federal building where Peck had lunch on Tuesdays. He listened. He watched. He let people talk to him the way people talk to someone they think is just passing through. 3 months into his time in Millhaven, someone started watching him back. The first sign was the car. A dark blue sedan parked across from his rental 2 mornings in a row. Different license plates, but Elijah noticed the same scuff on the front driver's side bumper. The second sign was a break-in that wasn't really a break-in. His back door was unlocked when he came home one evening. Nothing taken but his files, which he kept deliberately sparse and misleading. Slightly someone had looked. Someone wanted him to know they'd looked. The third sign was Detective Koval Sims. Sims was a Millhaven PD detective, 47, a man who walked like every hallway was too narrow for him. He showed up at Elijah's door on a Wednesday afternoon with a notepad and an expression that was almost friendly. "Mr. Cross, we've had some complaints from neighbors about a vehicle matching yours being parked near a commercial property on Reeves Avenue. Mind if I ask what you do for work?" The vehicle description was fabricated. Elijah's car had not been near Reeves Avenue. He knew it. Sims knew it. This was a different kind of visit, a warning, dressed as routine. "Legal research," Elijah said. "I work remotely. Happy to show you my employer documentation if that helps." Sims smiled. "No need, just checking." He glanced past Elijah into the house. "Not a search, just a look." "You plan on being in town long?" "Hard to say," Elijah said. "Depends on the work." That evening, Elijah sent an encrypted message to his team in Washington. The message read, "They know someone is watching. They don't know who. Proceed to Phase 2. Phase 2 was the part that required him to get closer. One of the attorneys whose cases Elijah had flagged, a defense attorney named Gwen Nakamura, who had been trying for 2 years to appeal a sentence she believed was corrupted, agreed to let a colleague consult on her case. That colleague was introduced to the court as Elijah Cross, legal consultant, retained by the defense. It put him in the courtroom. Legitimately, visibly, in a seat at the defense table in a case involving a man named Deshaun Whitfield, who had been sentenced to 11 years on a drug charge after a plea deal that Nakamura had documented as coerced. Nay, Harlan Peck saw Elijah Cross for the first time on a Monday morning in October. Peck's eyes moved across the defense table the way a man scans a room he already owns. When they landed on Elijah, something shifted. Not alarm, not recognition, just a recalibration. A man at Peck's defense table who he didn't recognize. Someone new. Peck was not used to new. The hearing that morning was procedural. Nakamura was filing for a sentence reduction based on newly reviewed evidence. Peck dismissed it in 11 minutes. He barely looked up from the bench. Afterward, in the hallway, Detective Sims appeared again. This time not alone. He had 2 uniformed officers with him and a document Elijah recognized immediately as a material witness subpoena. Except the case number on it corresponded to no active case Elijah's team could identify when they ran it that night. "Mr. Cross," Sims said, "we need you to come with us." There was a pause in the hallway that lasted maybe 4 seconds, long enough for 3 courthouse staff members to see, long enough for a law clerk who had been passing documents to Nakamura to freeze in place. "Of course," Elijah said. They took him to a holding room in the courthouse basement. Not a police precinct, not a formal interview space, a room with a table and 2 chairs that was designed to feel like the kind of place where people said things they later regretted. Sims dropped a folder on the table. Inside, photographs of Elijah outside what appeared to be a warehouse on the east side of Millhaven. The photographs were real. Elijah had surveilled that warehouse because it appeared in property transfer documents connected to Aldridge Crane. But in Sims's framing, his presence there was suspicious, criminal even, if you were building a narrative around it. "You want to explain what you were doing at that location?" Sims asked. "I'd like to contact my attorney," Elijah said. "That's your right, though this doesn't have to get complicated." Sims sat down, leaned back like a man with time to spare. "We've had reports of someone surveilling private property, running license plates, talking to city employees off the record. If that were connected to you, that could be a problem." Elijah looked at the photographs, looked at Sims. "I understand," he said. What happened over the next 72 hours was the thing Elijah had anticipated, documented, and, in the careful language of federal operations, allowed to proceed. Sims filed a formal complaint. The complaint triggered a hearing before the only judge available on short notice in the Millhaven Federal Courthouse. That judge was Harlan Peck. The charge, and Elijah's team confirmed this by reviewing the filing, was obstruction of a local investigation. The underlying investigation was 3 weeks old, fabricated from the same template Peck's network had used 4 times before against people who had gotten too close. Elijah's team had the other 4 cases in a binder back in Washington. Elijah Cross sat at the defense table in Courtroom 4B on a Thursday morning, charged with obstruction, without his attorney of record present. Nakamura had been deliberately delayed by a last-minute filing in a separate case, with a gallery half full of courthouse staff and 2 reporters who covered the federal beat. Harlan Peck took the bench at 9:14 a.m. He looked at the defendant. The defendant looked back at him. "Mr. Cross," Peck said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had not been challenged in 19 years. "You've been brought before this court on a serious matter. Do you have representation present?" "My attorney has been delayed, Your Honor. I'd like to request a continuance." "Denied." Peck said it the way he said everything, without pause, without looking up. "The court's schedule doesn't accommodate delays caused by defense counsel's failure to appear. We'll proceed." In the gallery, a woman named Rosalie Byrne, a local journalist who covered the courthouse beat and had been fed a tip that something interesting was happening in 4B this morning, wrote the word "denied" in her notebook and circled it. "You think you can walk into my courtroom?" Peck said, setting down his reading glasses, "and demand accommodations this court isn't obligated to provide." Elijah Cross looked at Harlan Peck for a long moment, and then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The room was not loud, but something changed in it. The atmospheric shift of a space where everyone present understood, at the same moment, that they were about to see something that would not look the same in an hour. Elijah placed a credentials wallet on the defense table. He opened it. He slid it forward so that it faced the bench. A gold badge, a federal identification card, 4 lines of text that, from the bench, would clearly, unmistakably. "Office of Judicial Integrity, United States Department of Justice." "Your Honor," Elijah said, and his voice was the calmest thing in the room. "My name is Elijah Cross. I am the Deputy Director of the DOJ's Office of Judicial Integrity. I have been conducting a lawful federal investigation into this court and into your conduct specifically for the past 14 months. The complaint filed against me this week was filed with your knowledge and constitutes an attempt to obstruct a federal investigation. I have documentation of that, along with the documentation of the charges that will be brought against you." He paused. "I'd like to request that continuance now." Harlan Peck did not move. His hand, which had been reaching for his gavel, stopped somewhere above the bench and did not come down. In the gallery, Rosalie Byrne had stopped writing. The pen was still in her hand. She would tell the story later, in print, on radio, in the documentary that came out 2 years after, that she had never, in 18 years of covering courts, seen a judge's face do what Harlan Peck's face did in that moment. "It wasn't fear exactly," she would say. "It was the look of a man realizing, all at once, that the floor he'd been standing on for 19 years wasn't floor at all." The 2 courthouse bailiffs looked at each other. One of them took a step forward, then stopped, because he didn't know. Nobody in that room knew, except Elijah, what the correct next move was. It was the law clerk, a 26-year-old named Antoine Webb, who made the first sound. He had been standing near the side door with a stack of documents for the next proceeding. He set them down on a chair very slowly and said, "To nobody in particular. Oh my God." Detective Sims, seated in the gallery, stood up, took one step toward the door, stopped, sat back down. Elijah Cross did not take his eyes off the bench. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd also like to note for the record that there are 12 federal agents currently positioned in and around this courthouse, that your phone communications have been monitored under a lawfully obtained warrant for the past 8 months, and that you received a call from a representative of Aldridge Crane Properties at 7:52 this morning, 42 minutes before this hearing was scheduled." He folded his hands. "So, shall we talk about a continuance, or would you prefer to hear the rest of what I have?" The silence that followed lasted long enough for Rosalie Byrne to fill half a page with shorthand. It lasted long enough for one of the uniformed officers who had accompanied Sims to quietly remove his hand from his belt. It lasted long enough for Harlan Peck, 19 years on the federal bench, son of a state senator, portrait in the lobby, to make a sound that was not quite a word. 3 minutes later, 2 DOJ field agents entered courtroom 4B through the rear doors. Harlan Peck was escorted from the bench at 9:31 a.m. Detective Sims was detained in the courthouse lobby. The 2 real estate firms, Aldridge Crane Properties and Montfort Capital Group, received federal warrants the same afternoon. The shell company, Carver Hill Consulting, was dissolved by its registered agent the following morning, which the DOJ had anticipated and already placed a hold on its accounts. The trial of Harlan Peck took 14 months. Elijah Cross testified for 6 hours across 2 days. He spoke quietly, precisely, the way his father would have recognized, not performing, not editorializing, just laying down facts like a man who has learned that facts, assembled with enough care, can hold more weight than any argument. Peck was convicted on 11 counts: bribery, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations under color of law, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. His portrait was removed from the courthouse lobby the week the verdict came in. Nobody voted on it. Someone just took it down. Deshaun Whitfield's sentence was vacated 3 months after Peck was removed from the bench. He walked out of a federal facility in Talladega on a Tuesday afternoon into a parking lot where his mother and his 2 daughters were waiting. His youngest daughter, who had been 4 years old when he went in, was 7 when she saw him come through those doors. She ran the whole length of the parking lot. He caught her and held on so long the other people in the parking lot had to look away. Tobias Reeves, the court clerk, who had spent 7 years filling a spiral notebook and then taken the longest shot of his life by mailing it to Birmingham, received a commendation from the DOJ. He kept the letter in the same drawer as the notebook. He did not frame it. He said he didn't need to. He said he already knew what he had done. Elijah Cross returned to Washington on a Sunday in November, 2 weeks after the verdict. He drove back the same way he had driven down, alone. No one following him this time. Through the part of Georgia where the pines go on so long you start to feel like the road is something the trees invented. He passed through Decatur on his way. He didn't stop, but he drove down the street where he grew up, past the house where his mother had worked doubles to keep the heat on, past the stretch of highway where his father had been pulled over 7 times for nothing. He drove it slow, the way you do when you're not going somewhere, when you're just remembering. His father had told him the law was bigger than the men who enforced it. Elijah had spent 20 years learning that wasn't automatically true, that it only became true when somebody made it true. When somebody chose the long road, the patient road, the road where you hold the thread until enough threads become something nobody can pull apart. He got back on the highway north as the sun was going down. He had 3 new cases waiting on his desk. He drove toward them.